Read one page, and I'll pay you $2 million. The voice came smooth and amused across the 42nd floor boardroom, and just like that, every sound in the room seemed to fold into silence. The clicking keyboard stopped first, then the whisper of legal pads. Then even the soft hum of the hidden air vents felt louder than it should have. Naomi Brooks stood beside her mother's janitor cart with one hand still resting on the metal handle, her small fingers curled around the chipped blue grip, her faded yellow hoodie hanging loose over narrow shoulders. She was 9 years old, 4'6" at most, with braids pulled back neatly and white sneakers worn gray at the toes. Under the cold wash of recessed ceiling lights, she looked far too small for the room. That was exactly why Richard Whitmore was smiling. He stood at the head of the glass conference table in a charcoal suit worth more than Denise Brooks made in 3 months, one hand resting on a leather folder, the other loosely adjusting the silver cuff at his wrist. He was a man used to rooms bending toward him, used to silence arriving on command, used to people laughing when he wanted them to laugh. And now a few of them did. Not loudly, just enough. A low ripple from the far side of the table. A woman in pearl earrings lowered her chin and smirked into her coffee. One of the junior analysts leaned back and exchanged a look with the man beside him. Denise froze beside the service wall, a fresh liner bag still in her hands, her shoulders tightening under her navy cleaning uniform. "Sir," she said softly, carefully. "She was just waiting for me to finish." Richard glanced at her without really seeing her. "Then she can wait 1 more minute," he said. His tone was light, almost playful, which somehow made it colder. The contract lay open in front of him, 73 pages of acquisition language, marked with tabs, notes, and yellow flags from 3 law firms and a dozen executives who had spent the last 6 hours circling clauses no one fully trusted. The company on the other side of the deal was promising expansion, leverage, international reach. Richard wanted control. The board wanted speed. The lawyers wanted caution. But caution did not look powerful, and Richard Whitmore had spent 20 years building a career on looking powerful. Naomi's eyes moved from the paper to his face and back again. She did not speak. She did not shrink. She only watched, and that unsettled him more than it should have. He slid the folder closer to the table's edge. "Come on," he said. "Read 1 page. Out loud. If you can do that, I'll wire your family $2 million before sunset." More laughter, this time sharper, more comfortable now that the room had decided what this was, a joke with a child at the center of it. Naomi looked at the document, then at the skyline beyond the windows where late afternoon light burned gold against the glass towers of Midtown. Her mother stepped forward 1/2 inch. "Naomi," Denise whispered, not out of anger, but fear. Fear had lived in her voice for years now. Fear of being noticed too much. Fear of saying the wrong thing in the wrong building to the wrong people. Naomi knew that fear well. She had heard it in laundromats and bus stops and back hallways all her life. But she had also heard something else. She had heard her grandfather's voice at the library table, slow and patient over stacks of donated law books with cracked bindings and yellowed margins. "Words are where rich people hide their traps, baby girl. Read slowly. Read twice. Read what they gain. Then read what they make you lose." Naomi stepped away from the janitor cart. The front wheel squeaked once, a small sound in the polished room. She moved toward the table, each step quiet against the dark stone floor, until she stood beneath a ring of white light reflected in the glass. Up close, the contract was even thicker than it had looked from the door. Pages layered with edits. Dense blocks of black serif text. Footnotes. Addendums. Defined terms in capital letters. The kind of document adults held like armor. Richard watched her with that same bright, easy smile, the kind men wore when they expected to enjoy someone else's embarrassment. "Well," he asked. Naomi placed both hands on the paper, steadying it. The pages were cool against her skin. She glanced down once, scanning the title, then the first paragraph, then the lower half of the page. Her eyes moved fast. Too fast for a child, one of the lawyers thought. Before catching himself, Elaine Parker, chief counsel, narrowed her gaze. Richard folded his arms. Somewhere near the wall, ice shifted softly in a glass. Naomi lifted her chin. When she finally spoke, her voice was clear, calm, and small in a way that forced everyone to lean in. "Do you want me to read it," she asked, "or tell you what it does?" This time nobody laughed right away. The question landed flat and hard in the center of the room. Richard's smile held for one beat too long. Then it tightened, just slightly, as if something inside him had missed a step. He leaned forward, palms against the table. "Tell me what it does," he said. Naomi lowered her gaze back to the page, touched a paragraph halfway down with one finger, and the room, without realizing it, stopped breathing. Naomi did not look up right away. Her fingertips stayed on the clause as if the paper itself had warmed beneath her hand, and for a moment the whole boardroom seemed to tilt around that one tiny point of contact. Outside the 42nd floor windows, Manhattan glowed in the late afternoon haze, all gold glass and hard edges. But inside the room the light felt colder now, flatter, stripped of its shine. Richard Whitmore straightened slowly, the confidence in his posture still there, but no longer effortless. Elaine Parker reached for her annotated copy of the agreement with a quick, precise motion, flipping pages until her bracelets gave a soft metallic click against the table. Across from her, a man from strategy adjusted his glasses and leaned in. Nobody spoke. Naomi traced the line once, then read in a clear, even voice. In the event of post-closing disputes, regulatory actions, or operational defaults arising from prior disclosures, full remedial and financial responsibility shall transfer to the acquiring party. She stopped, then added, "That means if the company they are selling you turns out to be hiding a problem, you pay for it after the deal closes." The sentence hung in the air. No flourish, no fear, just plain truth. One of the junior associates let out a quiet breath he had not realized he was holding. Elaine's eyes flicked from Naomi to the page, then back again. "That is not the full interpretation," she said, though her voice came out thinner than she intended. Naomi nodded once. "It keeps going," she said. She moved her finger lower, to a section boxed between two references in smaller type. "This part says the seller is only responsible if they already admitted the problem in writing before the deal is signed. But if they did not tell you, and you do not catch it now, then it becomes your problem anyway." Denise Brooks stood near the wall with both hands clasped so tightly around the trash liner that the plastic had gone white at the folds. Her eyes were on her daughter, wide with pride and panic tangled together so tightly they almost looked like pain. Richard noticed that expression and looked away from it fast. He was no longer enjoying himself. Naomi turned one page with care. The paper sounded loud in the silence. "And this is connected to the definition section in the back," she said. "Because they changed what counts as material harm." Daniel Cross, the in-house attorney seated halfway down the table, frowned and began flipping to the appendix. He had spent 3 hours in this very chair, tie loosened, coffee cooling at his elbow, reviewing revisions from opposing counsel. He had flagged timing provisions, governance language, executive retention. He had not flagged this. Now his fingers moved faster. "Page 68. Naomi said softly, before he found it. Daniel stopped, looked at her, then turned exactly there. The room shifted. You could feel it. Not in any dramatic way. In smaller ways. In the slight scrape of a chair leg. In the sudden stillness of a woman who had been reaching for her phone and no longer was. In the way Richard's jaw set, not with anger now, but with concentration. Daniel scanned the cross-reference, then the clause on the first page, then the amended definition buried in the appendix. The color changed in his face first. "Wait," he murmured. Elaine snapped. "Let me see that." He slid the document toward her without taking his eyes off Naomi. Richard moved around the head of the table and planted both palms on the glass. "Explain it to me," he said. The room had lost its laughter completely. Naomi looked at the billionaire for the first time since she had started speaking. His expression had changed. He still looked powerful. Men like Richard Whitmore always did. But now he also looked like a man standing half an inch from a hole he had not seen in the floor. Naomi swallowed once and answered in the same calm voice. "They made the danger sound smaller in the back pages than it sounds in the front. So when you read the first part, it looks normal. But the back part changes the meaning. If you buy them, then something bad comes out later, they can say it was not material under their definition. That means they keep the money, and you keep the problem." Daniel leaned back in his chair as if the air had been pushed out of him. Elaine scanned the pages again, faster now, lips pressed into a thin line. One of the executives from finance whispered, "How much exposure?" Daniel did not answer immediately. He ran the numbers in his head, eyes still on the clause. "Regulatory fines. litigation, disclosure failures, shareholder actions, reputation loss, delayed integration. He looked up at Richard at last. Best case? Tens of millions. Worst case? He stopped. He did not finish because he did not have to. Richard's face went still in the way only very controlled men can manage when they are suddenly furious at themselves. Naomi stood in the white circle of reflected light, small and steady beside a document that had almost trapped a room full of adults. Elaine finally spoke, but there was no mockery left in her voice now. Who taught you to read contracts like this? Naomi glanced down at the page again, then toward her mother by the wall. My grandpa used to say people hide the truth in long words, she said. So I learned to look for what moves the risk. And at that exact moment, Richard Whitmore understood that the smartest person in his boardroom had walked in behind a janitor cart, and he had almost laughed her back out the door. Richard Whitmore did not sit back down. He stayed there with both hands pressed against the glass table, shoulders squared, staring at the open contract as if it had changed shape in front of him. The boardroom had gone so quiet that Naomi could hear the faint buzz from the recessed lights above and the dull rattle of an ice cube settling in a forgotten water glass near the end of the table. Nobody touched a phone. Nobody whispered now. The room that had laughed at her 10 minutes ago looked different, smaller somehow, as if the walls of tinted glass and polished steel had lost some of their authority. Elaine Parker kept reading with rigid focus, one red-painted nail following the lines Naomi had pointed out. Daniel Cross had already opened the appendix flat, his tie loose at the collar, his legal pad dragged close. The pen in his hand moved fast, underlining sections he had missed the first time. From the service wall, Denise Brooks still had not moved. Her cart stood beside her with its bottles of cleaner, folded cloths, and fresh trash liners. All the plain tools of a job people noticed only when it was not done right. Naomi glanced at her mother for half a second and saw the same thing she always saw in rooms like this. Caution first, then worry, then strength, trying very hard not to look like fear. Denise had spent years cleaning offices full of people who spoke as if women like her were part of the furniture. Blend in. Finish your shift. Go home. That had been the rule. Naomi had broken it the moment she touched the contract. How did you catch that? Richard asked at last. His voice was lower now. Not softer, just stripped of performance. Naomi looked down at the page before answering. Because they repeated the promise too many times, she said. Daniel paused writing. Elaine lifted her head. Richard frowned. What does that mean? Naomi took a breath and pointed at the first section again. When people tell the truth, they usually say it once and make it clear. When they are hiding something, they keep saying the safe part over and over, so you stop looking for the dangerous part. No one answered. The words landed harder than anyone expected, maybe because they were simple, maybe because they were true. Richard's eyes narrowed, not at her, but at the paper. And you saw that from one page. Naomi nodded. I saw it from the way the sentence was built. A faint shift passed through the room, the kind that comes when adults realize they are no longer speaking to a child the way they first assumed. One of the board members, a gray-haired man who had barely looked at Naomi before, slowly removed his glasses and set them on the table. Sentence built how? He asked. Naomi turned to him politely. The first half sounds protective, she said. The second half changes who carries the loss. They put the comfort first and the damage second. That makes people relax before the trap closes. Daniel exhaled through his nose and looked at Richard. She is right. It is not just the clause. It is the framing. Elaine said nothing for a long moment. Then she closed her copy halfway and looked directly at Naomi, her face composed, but no longer skeptical. That kind of reading is not normal for a 9-year-old. Naomi gave a small shrug, not rude, not shy, just honest. Maybe not. Richard studied her more carefully now. The worn sneakers, the neat braids, the steady shoulders, the total absence of showmanship. There was no excitement in her expression, no childish delight at shocking a room full of powerful adults. If anything, she looked mildly sad that she had needed to explain something they should have caught on their own. That unsettled him more than anything else. Men like Richard Whitmore had built entire lives on being the fastest mind in the room, the most prepared, the hardest to fool. He had walked into this meeting expecting to dominate terms, pressure timelines, and close a deal before market rumors could push up the price. Instead, He was standing in a boardroom full of six-figure minds while a girl who still had multiplication charts taped over her desk at home had just saved him from signing a trap. Elaine finally leaned back. "We need a full halt," she said. "Now." Richard did not answer right away. He was looking past the contract now, past the table, past the executives, all the way to the janitor cart near the wall. A slim metal frame, gray wheels, a yellow caution tag folded over one side. Beside it stood Denise Brooks in a navy uniform with a stitched patch over the chest and cleaning spray on one sleeve. It struck him then with almost physical force that Naomi had not come from nowhere. She had entered through the only door the building barely respected. Service access, freight elevator, maintenance corridor, the invisible route. He thought about the joke he had made, the money, the laughter, the easy cruelty of treating intelligence as entertainment because of who carried it into the room. His mouth tightened. "Mrs. Brooks," he said. Denise looked up, startled by the direct address. "Yes, sir. How often does your daughter come here with you?" The question changed the air all over again. Denise hesitated. Naomi went still. "Only sometimes, sir," Denise said carefully. "When after-school care falls through or the library closes early. She stays quiet. She reads. She does not bother anyone." Richard's gaze shifted to Naomi. "What do you read?" Naomi answered without hesitation. "Library books. Court cases when I can find them. Old contracts my grandpa kept in boxes. Anything with hidden meaning." A strange sound escaped one of the executives. Not laughter. Something closer to disbelief wrapped in shame. Richard straightened slowly, his reflection fractured across the glass tabletop beneath him. Then Daniel Cross turned one more page, stopped cold, and said in a voice that made every head lift, "Richard, she only showed us the first trap. There is another one buried in the transition schedule." Naomi looked at the page, then at Daniel, and for the first time since entering the room, the adults saw something flash across her face that made their stomachs drop. She already knew. Daniel Cross did not blink for a full second after he spoke. His finger stayed pressed to the transition schedule as though the paper itself might slide away if he let go, and the stillness that followed felt different from the earlier silence. Before, the room had gone quiet because of surprise. Now it was quiet because of fear. Richard Whitmore moved around the side of the table with measured steps, the leather soles of his shoes making soft, deliberate sounds against the dark stone floor. He stopped beside Daniel and looked down at the page. Elaine Parker stood too, abandoning her chair entirely now, her copy of the agreement open in both hands, red annotations crawling through the margins like veins. Naomi remained where she was, small and straight in the reflected ring of white boardroom light, her hands resting lightly against the glass edge. Denise stayed by the service wall, but the trash liner in her hands had slipped half open without her noticing. Nobody in that room was pretending anymore. Daniel cleared his throat. "The post-merger staffing schedule," he said. They delayed the operational transition language to Appendix 12 and tied it to vendor continuity. Richard looked at him sharply. "English." Daniel swallowed. "If this closes as written, they can terminate your domestic support vendors within 90 days and move all facilities contracts through their approved network." Richard frowned for half a beat. Then his expression hardened. "They want our cleaning, maintenance, logistics, security, all rebid through their people." "Yes," Elaine said quietly, reading as she spoke. "And because it is framed as efficiency integration, it looks procedural, not hostile." Naomi lowered her eyes to the page Daniel was holding and said, "It is not just that." The words were not loud, but the whole room shifted toward her again. Richard turned first. "What else?" Naomi pointed to a narrow section beneath the staffing grid, the kind of boxed note busy executives usually skim once and trust their lawyers to interpret. "That line says only approved transition partners can keep full building access after 90 days. If they replace the vendors, then the new company decides who gets badges and who does not." Denise's fingers tightened around the plastic liner. Elaine read the line, then the cross-reference attached to it, and a look passed across her face that was colder than panic. It was recognition. She had seen something ugly at last and knew it had been there the whole time. "They are not just buying leverage," she said. "They are buying entry points." One of the board members straightened in his chair. "Meaning?" Naomi answered before anyone else could. meaning they can move your people out without making it look personal. The sentence landed heavily. Too heavily for a child's voice. That was what made it hit. Richard stared at the schedule, but he was no longer only reading the contract. He was seeing the building beneath him, floor by floor. Reception, security desk, freight elevators, night cleaning crews, badge readers clicking green or red, men and women whose names he barely knew, but whose absence would change how the whole company breathed after dark. He thought of Denise in her Navy uniform, of the quiet route service workers used to move through a tower built by people who never noticed the hands that kept it running. The deal on the table was supposed to make him larger, stronger, untouchable. But buried in the fine print was a neat little machine for replacing the invisible people first. They knew exactly what they were doing, Elaine said. Yes, Naomi replied. That is why they buried it in the transition schedule instead of the labor section. People expect money tricks in one place. They do not expect them in the map. Daniel looked up from the paper. In the map, he repeated softly, as if testing the phrase against his own professional pride. Naomi nodded. Contracts are maps, she said. Most people only look at where they are going. Smart people also look at who gets erased on the way there. No one wrote that down, but everyone remembered it. Richard straightened and took one slow breath through his nose. The skyline outside had dimmed another shade, the sunlight flattening into copper against the western glass, and the boardroom lights had begun to dominate the room completely. Under that cold brightness, every polished surface looked harsher than before. How far does it go? He asked. Elaine flipped deeper into the appendix. Daniel scanned the vendor exhibits. A vice president from operations pulled the digital draft onto the wall screen with a shaky hand. Lines of legal text expanded across the glass like a confession. Naomi watched them work with a calmness that did not belong to a child, and yet belonged to her perfectly. Denise looked at her daughter as if she was seeing two girls at once. The one who still asked for grape popsicles on hot Saturdays, and the one who could walk into a billionaire's boardroom and read danger faster than a table full of adults. Daniel was the first to find the next layer. There, he said, voice tight. Preferred transition vendors are exempt from existing continuity review if classified as strategic consolidators. Elaine closed her eyes briefly. They could swap out half the support structure in one quarter and call it operational alignment. Richard's jaw flexed. Including her, he said, glancing toward Denise. No one answered because no one needed to. Denise did not lower her eyes this time. She stood with her shoulders back, still afraid, still outnumbered, but no longer invisible. Naomi looked at Richard and saw the exact moment something in him stopped being abstract. For the first time since she entered the room, he was not thinking only about liability, profit, and exposure. He was thinking about people. About one woman in a service uniform who would have vanished from payroll inside a sentence he never planned to read himself. He looked at Naomi for a long moment. You saw all that in one pass. Naomi gave a small nod. My grandpa used to say the first trap takes your money, she said. The second trap takes your people. A quiet chill moved through the room. Richard glanced back at the contract, then at the executives who had nearly signed it, then at the child standing beneath the white lights with old sneakers and a steady face. The humiliation of it pressed hot behind his ribs, but beneath that was something stranger and harder to resist. Respect arriving late and all at once. Then the boardroom doors opened softly, and Richard's assistant stepped in with a tablet in hand and said, Sir, the sellers team is on the line. They are asking if you are ready to finalize. No one in the room moved. Naomi turned toward the dark screen at the end of the table, and when she did, her expression changed just enough for Daniel to notice. Not fear. Recognition. She had seen one more thing no one else had caught yet, and whatever it was, it made the call waiting on that screen far more dangerous than anyone in the room understood. The assistant with the tablet did not step any farther into the room. He stood just inside the doorway in a navy suit that suddenly looked too crisp for the tension hanging in the air, the screen in his hand casting a cold rectangle of light across his fingers. They are asking if you are ready to finalize, he repeated, softer this time, as though the words themselves had become unsafe. Richard Whitmore did not answer. He was looking at the dark conference screen on the wall as if it might blink first. Around the table, executives who had built careers on speed, confidence, and polished instinct now sat very still with open contracts and unsettled faces, trapped in that humiliating space between almost and too late. Naomi Brooks kept her eyes on the inactive screen for one long second, then shifted them back to the paper in Daniel Cross's hands. Something in her face had changed. It was slight, almost invisible, but Daniel saw it because he was finally paying attention to everything she did. "What is it?" he asked. Naomi did not speak at once. She reached for the lower corner of the transition schedule and slid it gently toward herself, not with the eagerness of a child trying to impress adults, but with the caution of someone following a thread she did not want to break. Her finger moved to the footer. Tiny print. Version control. Revision dates. Routing initials. The things busy people trusted teams to handle. "This one is not the same," she said. Elaine Parker looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" Naomi tapped the bottom right corner. The draft on the screen summary and the draft on this page were not made at the same time. Elaine took the paper from Daniel and checked the footer. Her eyes narrowed. Daniel pulled the digital file closer on his laptop. Richard finally moved, walking to the center of the table again, not speaking, his attention fixed now with a force that made everyone else lean in too. Naomi pointed once more. "The summary packet says revised at 4:12 this afternoon. This appendix says revised at 5:37. The room went cold all over again. Richard looked at his watch without thinking. It was 6:14. One of the board members frowned. "So?" Naomi turned toward him politely. "So somebody changed the back pages after the summary was sent out. No one filled the silence after that. No one could." Elaine checked the metadata on the digital version and then flipped back to the printed executive summary clipped at the front of the packet. Her mouth parted slightly. Daniel was already doing the same comparison on screen, clicking through track file properties with suddenly urgent hands. "She is right," he said. "The summary file was locked earlier. The appendix revision is later." Richard's gaze sharpened into something dangerous. "Without disclosure?" Elaine did not look up. "Unless they notified outside counsel separately, yes." "Did they?" Richard asked. Daniel did not answer right away. He was scrolling through email timestamps now, jaw tense, pulse visible at his throat. The assistant by the door lowered the tablet a fraction, forgotten for the moment. Naomi stood quiet in the glow of the room, one hand resting on the edge of the table, her yellow hoodie sleeve slipping back enough to show a pencil mark near her wrist from some earlier note she must have written and absent-mindedly rubbed against her skin. Small details suddenly seemed enormous to Richard. The pencil smudge, the scuffed shoes, the way she never raised her voice and still controlled the room. Daniel looked up at last. "There was a revised attachment from opposing counsel at 5:42, he said. "Marked administrative cleanup." Elaine closed her eyes for a second, then opened them with a face gone pale and exact. "Administrative cleanup," she repeated. "They rewrote liability timing, vendor continuity, and access control, and called it cleanup." Richard let out one breath through his nose, but the sound carried more force than a shout. "Put them on the screen," he said. The assistant near the door hesitated. "Sir." "Put them on." The room came alive at once, but in that tightly controlled way panic moves through powerful people who know public mistakes cost more than private ones. Chairs shifted. Files straightened. The wall screen flickered from black to the elegant logo of the seller's company. Then the video feed opened. 3 faces appeared in separate polished boxes of light. A silver-haired chief executive in California, their lead attorney in Chicago, and a mergers consultant calling from what looked like a private office with walnut shelves and framed awards behind him. Their smiles were smooth, prepared, expensive. Richard remained standing. He did not return their greeting. "Before we proceed," he said, "I want to discuss the revised appendix you sent after the summary packet was locked." For the first time since the call connected, a small delay entered the faces on screen. Barely a beat. But Naomi saw it. Daniel saw it too, now that he had been taught where to look. The attorney recovered first. "Just final formatting clarifications," she said. "Nothing material." Naomi's eyes lifted slowly to the screen. There it was again. That word. Material. The same soft hiding place. Richard noticed the shift in her expression and said, "No. Let us use clearer language tonight." His voice was calm, but no one in the room mistook calm for kindness anymore. He placed one hand flat on the conference table and continued, "You changed indemnity exposure, transition vendor authority, and access continuity after briefing my team, and you did it under an administrative label. The silver-haired chief executive smiled, but the smile no longer reached his eyes. Richard, I think that is an overstatement. Naomi's gaze moved to the lower left of the wall screen, where the call details were displayed in tiny text. Connection time. Participant list. Meeting title. She stared at it for a second longer than anyone else, and then a new stillness came over her, deeper than before. Richard was still speaking, Elaine was still turning pages, Daniel was still collecting timestamps, but Naomi had found something else. Something not in the contract. Something in the meeting itself. She looked at the participant list once, then back to the silver-haired chief executive, and asked in a voice so soft the room had to bend toward it to hear, "Why is there a fourth person on the call if only 3 of you are on the screen?" For a fraction of a second, nobody on either side of the call moved. The seller's chief executive kept his pleasant expression in place, but it no longer looked natural. It looked attached. The attorney in Chicago blinked once, too fast. The merger's consultant shifted in his seat and reached for a glass of water he suddenly seemed to need. On the boardroom wall, the participant panel remained tucked in the corner of the screen in small gray type most adults had not bothered to notice. 3 video windows. 4 names connected. Naomi Brooks was still staring at it. Richard Whitmore turned toward the screen fully now, one hand braced on the glass table, the other hanging still at his side. "Answer her," he said. The words were quiet, but they cut clean through the room. The chief executive gave a brief laugh that landed nowhere. Probably an assistant sitting in for note capture. Elaine Parker was already at the console, widening the participant menu with one sharp tap of her finger. The boardroom lights reflected across the screen, silver against black, as the hidden panel expanded. Names appeared in a vertical list. The 3 visible participants at the top. And below them, muted, camera off, one more connection identified only by initials and a locked host badge. Daniel Cross leaned in. "That is not a note-taker designation," he said. Naomi did not look away. "No," she said. "It is a host control." Another silence, sharper this time. The attorney on the call began to speak, but Richard raised one hand, and she stopped. "Who is it?" he asked. The chief executive smiled again, but the confidence had thinned. "Richard, let us not derail the deal over a conferencing technicality." Naomi's eyes shifted from the participant list to the meeting title printed above it. Her head tilted slightly. Then she looked at Richard. "It is not this meeting's name." Elaine froze with her hand still near the screen controls. Daniel turned toward the title bar. Richard stepped closer. The current call window said Executive Final Review, but the metadata above the hidden participant list showed a longer host session label embedded behind it, one that had not been meant for anyone outside the organizer to see. Naomi read it out loud, slowly, every word clear. Whitmore Integration Closeout. The boardroom went dead still. Richard's face changed in a way only Naomi, standing nearest the light, could fully see. Not confusion, not even anger at first. Recognition. The kind that arrives when a truth you were not supposed to hear finally says your name. Elaine looked from the title to the contract appendix, and then back again. "Closeout," she repeated. Daniel's expression tightened. "Not merger. Not acquisition. Closeout." The seller's chief executive stopped pretending to be relaxed. "That label means nothing," he said. "Internal admin shorthand." But the words had come too fast. Too neat. Naomi rested her small hand against the edge of the glass table and studied the lower corner of the screen again. "Then why is the hidden host not from your company?" she asked. Elaine clicked into the participant details. A domain appeared beside the muted user. Not the seller's firm. Not outside counsel. A restructuring consultancy. The kind companies hired when they wanted controlled asset transfers, workforce compression, and post-sale dismantling dressed up in elegant language. Daniel saw it first and whispered, "Oh no." Richard did not whisper. "Say it." Daniel swallowed. "They were not selling to join us. They were positioning us to absorb their liabilities, then hand parts of our own structure to a restructuring operator under transition authority." Richard's eyes lifted slowly to the screen. The chief executive in California was no longer smiling at all. Elaine drew in a breath through her teeth and began flipping back through the appendix with urgent hands. Vendor continuity. Badge access. Strategic consolidators. Deferred material definitions. It all lines up. Naomi stood very still. She had followed the shape before she knew the name. Now the adults finally had the name too. The consultant on the call tried to recover the moment. "This is becoming highly interpretive," he said. Richard looked at him with a stillness that felt colder than shouting. "No," he said. "Interpretive is when language is unclear. This is when language is arranged." The room did not move. Denise Brooks remained by the service wall, one hand pressed lightly against the janitor card, as if it were the only familiar object left in a world that had tilted too far. Her daughter, 9 years old in scuffed sneakers and a faded yellow hoodie, had just peeled back another polished layer of a transaction worth hundreds of millions of dollars and found a machine underneath it. A machine built to smile, rename, reroute, and erase. Richard turned from the screen and looked at Naomi directly. "What made you check the meeting title?" he asked. Naomi answered in the same calm voice she had used all evening. "Because people lie with labels when they want you to stop asking questions." No one on the call had a response ready for that. Elaine finally found another cross-reference in the appendix and laid her palm flat against the page. "Richard," she said, "if that host is who I think it is, they were planning the post-signing operational carve-outs before the deal even closed." Daniel added, "Which means the revised appendix was not cleanup. It was activation." The word hit the room like a dropped weight. Activation. Richard looked back at the wall screen, then at the participant list, then at the contract spread open under white boardroom light. He had spent years believing the most dangerous people in business were the loud ones, the greedy ones, the arrogant ones. But the truly dangerous ones, he now realized, were the people who hid destruction inside admin language and calendar invites. The chief executive on the screen began to speak again, but Richard cut him off. "Do not say another word until you tell me the full name of the fourth participant." A pause followed. Not a normal pause. Not the pause of someone checking notes. The pause of someone deciding what version of the truth would do the least damage. Naomi saw it before anyone else. She saw the attorney glance off screen. Saw the consultant's jaw tense. Saw the chief executive's eyes move for just 1 second to a point outside the camera frame, as if waiting for permission from someone who was not visible. Then, from the boardroom speaker itself, a new voice entered the call. Calm. Male. Unmuted at last. "My name is Adrian Vale," it said, "and if the little girl is this observant, Mr. Whitmore, then you should be very careful what you sign next." The new voice came through the boardroom speaker without static, without hurry, without the smallest trace of apology. It did not belong to a man surprised to be discovered. It belonged to a man who had always assumed the room would eventually have to answer to him. "My name is Adrian Vale," he said again, calm and clean, as if he were introducing himself at a private dinner instead of stepping out from behind a hidden host line in the middle of a poisoned deal. The 3 visible faces on the screen had gone still. Not shocked, not offended. Still in the way people become when the real authority has finally chosen to speak for itself. Richard Whitmore did not move, but Naomi saw the change in him immediately. Men like Richard were used to power wearing expensive watches, custom suits, and practice smiles. They were less used to power hiding off camera, waiting inside the wiring, deciding when to reveal its name. "You are not on the briefing documents," Richard said. Adrian Vale gave a soft exhale that could have been amusement. "No, I am not meant to be." Elaine Parker was already typing, fingers striking her laptop keys with clipped speed, searching filings, restructuring registries, private holdings, shell advisories, anything that carried the name Vale. Daniel Cross stayed frozen over the appendix, eyes shifting between the speaker icon on the wall screen and the pages Naomi had exposed one by one. Denise Brooks did not understand all of the legal architecture unfolding around her, but she understood tone, class, danger, and the way powerful men changed a room when they stopped pretending to be polite. Naomi kept her gaze on the screen. She did not fidget. She did not look toward her mother for reassurance. She only listened. Adrian continued, "Mr. Whitmore, I would advise you to end this review and proceed through counsel tomorrow. There is no reason to let a child turn this into theater." That sentence did what no contract clause had managed to do. It made the room colder. Because the contempt inside it was too familiar. Too easy. Too aimed. Naomi was no longer an inconvenient observer to him. She was a child. A little black girl in a hoodie. Someone to diminish before she could become dangerous. Richard heard it too. So did Elaine. So did every person around the glass table who had laughed earlier and now had to sit with the memory of it. Richard's voice came back low and exact. There is every reason. She has found more in 20 minutes than your visible team disclosed in 6 hours. Adrian did not respond right away. The silence from the speaker carried a texture Naomi recognized. Not confusion. Calculation. When he spoke again, his tone had changed by half a shade. And what exactly do you believe she has found? Naomi answered before Richard could. The part where your plan starts before the signing ends. The sentence landed so cleanly that even Elaine stopped typing for a second. Daniel slowly looked up. On the call screen, the merger's consultant shifted in his chair, then stilled. The attorney in Chicago parted her lips as if to object, but nothing came out. Adrian's voice returned, a little tighter now. That is a dramatic interpretation. Naomi shook her head once. No, it is timing. She stepped closer to the wall screen, the reflected light bright along the edges of her braids. The summary packet was locked before the appendix changes. The hidden host joined before the final review. The meeting title says closeout, not merger. And the transition language gives your people building access before the risks are fully settled. She paused, then added in the same clear voice. You were already moving in. Daniel leaned back in his chair as though the truth had taken physical space. Elaine looked at Richard. Richard looked at the speaker icon. No one on the visible side of the seller's call interrupted Naomi now. That was the part that mattered. Not the denial. Not the legal phrasing. The silence. Because silence from powerful people was often the first honest thing they offered. Richard folded his arms. Mr. Vale, he said, what is your role in this transaction? Advisory, Adrian replied. That word means nothing, Richard said. Everything in this deal has meant something you hoped we would not inspect. A faint clicking sound came from the boardroom speakers, like someone on the other end shifting a ring against a desk. Naomi heard it. She heard other things too. A distant hum, lower than office air conditioning. An echo behind his voice. Too open for a small office. Not home. Not a car. She glanced up toward the recessed speakers as if they might tell her more. You are not where they are, she said. Elaine turned. Naomi. But Naomi was already listening harder. Eyes narrowed not in fear, but in concentration. Adrian let out the smallest laugh. And where do you think I am? Somewhere bigger, Naomi said. Not an office. There is an echo behind you. And the air system is louder. Maybe a conference room. Maybe a floor with a lot of glass. She tilted her head. You are not hidden because you are unimportant. You are hidden because you are closer than they said. That changed everything. Richard's eyes sharpened. Elaine stopped typing again. Daniel looked toward the boardroom door, without realizing he had done it. Denise's hand tightened on the janitor card handle until the metal gave a faint squeak. Adrian did not answer immediately, and in that pause, Naomi understood she had stepped into the right place. Not by proving she was brilliant, by proving he was near. Elaine turned her laptop slightly, bringing up preliminary search results. Richard, she said quietly, Adrian Vale is not listed as outside restructuring counsel. He controls Vale's strategic transitions. They specialize in post-acquisition operational compression. Daniel added, voice dry, which is a very elegant way of saying they move in fast, cut deep, and rename the damage. Richard's jaw tightened. He looked toward the dark windows of his own boardroom, where the city reflected back in broken fragments over the glass. 42 floors above Manhattan, surrounded by his people, his lawyers, his deal, his tower, and for the first time that evening, he felt the possibility that someone had entered his house before he ever signed the invitation. Naomi looked back at the participant list and then at the speaker icon. You joined too early, she said. Adrian's voice came softer now, almost conversational. How do you know that? Naomi's answer was immediate. Because people who think they already own the room stop being careful inside it. No one breathed for a beat after that. Then Richard turned to his assistant at the door and said, lock this floor down. No badge changes. No visitors. No one enters this boardroom corridor without my approval. The assistant straightened at once and disappeared into the hall. On the wall screen, the silver-haired chief executive opened his mouth to object, but Richard did not even look at him. He was staring at the speaker icon now, at the hidden voice that had revealed too much simply by trying to sound untouchable. And then Naomi, small beneath the white light, lifted one hand and pointed not at the screen this time, but at the frosted glass wall beside the boardroom doors. Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. "He is here." The room did not react all at once. It tightened. That was the first thing Naomi felt after she whispered those two words. Not panic, not disbelief. Tightening. Like the whole 42nd floor had pulled its shoulders back and stopped breathing. Richard Whitmore turned toward the frosted glass wall beside the boardroom doors with a slowness that made everyone else follow a second later. Elaine Parker rose halfway from her chair, one hand still braced on her laptop. Daniel Cross looked up so fast his pen rolled across the glass table and spun in a quiet silver circle before falling still. Denise Brooks did not move at all, but her eyes lifted to the door, wide and fixed. On the wall screen, the Sellers team had gone silent again. Even Adrian Vale's voice did not come back right away. That silence told Richard more than any answer could have. Naomi was still pointing at the frosted glass. The boardroom lights cast pale reflections across it, widening the surface until the outer corridor became only a blurred suggestion of movement and shadow. Then there it was. Not a full silhouette, just the faint interruption of light near the lower edge of the panel, as if someone had shifted weight outside and stepped back too late. Richard's face changed. The control did not leave him. Men like him did not lose control in public, but it sharpened into something harder, stripped clean of performance. "Open the door," he said. No one moved for half a beat. Then Elaine looked toward Daniel. Daniel looked toward the assistant station outside the conference system, and Richard repeated it without raising his voice. "Open the door." The lock released with a soft mechanical click. Richard stepped forward himself and pulled the boardroom door wide. Cold corridor lights spilled in across the dark floor, flattening the room for an instant. Beyond the threshold, the executive hallway stretched sleek and empty between framed abstract art and floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the city. For one impossible second, it looked like Naomi had been wrong. No one stood there. No hidden strategist. No waiting consultant. No expensive suit caught in the act. Just a polished corridor and the hush of a building built for wealth. Then Richard looked down. A paper coffee cup sat on the credenza outside the boardroom, still warm enough that a thread of steam lifted from the plastic lid. Beside it lay a visitor badge face down on the wood. Daniel stepped closer and turned it over. The badge was temporary, printed 34 minutes earlier. Visitor name, Aaron Voss. Company field, blank. Access zone, executive conference corridor. Denise made a small sound in the back of her throat. Not fear exactly, but the human noise people make when reality moves faster than they can keep up with it. Richard took the badge from Daniel and stared at it. "Vale," Elaine said softly from behind him. "Voss. Same initials. Same shape. He is using a corridor alias." Naomi lowered her hand, but did not relax. She was listening again. To the hallway. To the distant elevator bank. To the softened rhythm of the building. She looked past Richard's shoulder toward the far end of the corridor where the executive elevators sat behind smoked glass. One of the indicator lights had just changed. Down arrow. Someone leaving. "He was waiting to hear if you would sign," Naomi said. Richard turned toward her. "How do you know?" Naomi glanced at the coffee cup. "Because he stayed close enough to listen, but not close enough to be seen. And he left after you locked the floor." Daniel moved to the hall phone mounted near the credenza and pressed the security line. No answer. He tried again. Still nothing. Elaine was already at her laptop, pulling badge logs from the internal network. "There was a temporary authorization issued at 5:49, she said. "Executive corridor access. Sponsored by Conference Services." Richard looked toward the elevator bank again. "Conference Services does not clear private visitors to this floor." "No," Elaine said. "But someone with admin privileges can." The wall screen behind them still showed the Sellers live call. 3 visible faces. 1 hidden host now disconnected. Participant count, 3. Adrian Vale had left the call. Not just muted. Gone. Richard stepped back into the boardroom, coffee cup and badge still in hand. And the room shifted around him like iron filings around a magnet. He set both items on the glass table in front of the open contract. Cheap paper cup. Temporary badge. 2 plain objects under white light, and somehow they looked more dangerous than the entire polished deal packet had looked an hour ago. "Pull every access log for the last 2 hours, he said. "All badge activity. All elevator calls. All service corridor movement. Elaine nodded and began typing faster. Daniel moved to the wall console and tried security again. Still nothing. Naomi looked at the coffee cup without touching it. He was here before the call started, she said. Denise finally found her voice. Baby, how can you tell? Naomi pointed to the side of the cup. The cardboard sleeve had a faint crescent crease pressed into it, like it had been held for a long time in one hand while the other hand did something else. The coffee line inside the lid had dried slightly near the vent hole. It is not hot enough to be new, Naomi said. And if he brought it in after the floor was locked, the sleeve would not be bent like that. He was standing outside for a while. Daniel looked at her, then at the cup, then back at her again with the same stunned respect he had been wearing for the last 30 minutes. Richard said nothing. He was reading the hallway in his mind now. The position of the credenza, the line of sight through frosted glass, the distance from the elevator bank, the fact that someone had stood outside his boardroom long enough to listen, long enough to believe he belonged there, long enough to leave a half-finished coffee behind. Power did not only hide in contracts. It hid in access, in hallways, in assumptions. On the screen, the silver-haired chief executive finally tried to reclaim the moment. Richard, if this has become a security concern, perhaps we should reconvene tomorrow. Richard turned toward the wall screen slowly. You will do nothing tomorrow that I do not authorize tonight. His voice was calm again, but now calm sounded like steel. The chief executive began to answer, but Elaine cut in without looking up from her laptop. Richard. He turned. Her face had gone pale in a new way. Not shocked. Confirmed. The temporary badge was not created by conference services, she said. It was issued under your internal executive credential. No one in the room spoke. Even the city beyond the windows seemed to recede. Richard stared at her. That is not possible. Elaine rotated the laptop. There it was in clean system text. Sponsor, our Whitmore executive override. Timestamp, 5:49 p.m. Richard's own access authority had been used to bring Adrian Vale onto the floor. Richard looked from the screen to the badge to the contract, and then to Naomi, who stood small and steady in the middle of a room full of adults finally understanding the size of the trap. Naomi's eyes moved once toward the leather folder Richard had first placed on the table when he made his joke. The folder with the printed packet. The folder only one person had touched before the meeting began. Her voice came soft, but every word reached the walls. He did not need your permission, she said. He just needed something that already belonged to you. The words stayed on the table like a live wire. He did not need your permission. He just needed something that already belonged to you. Richard Whitmore looked at the leather folder as if it might answer for itself. It lay half open beside the contract packet, expensive and ordinary, the kind of object no one questions in a room built on routine privilege. A smooth black folder. Embossed initials. Cream paper. Everything about it said control. Everything about it now looked compromised. Richard reached for it with deliberate fingers and opened the inside flap. The scent of leather and paper rose faintly under the cold boardroom lights. At first glance, nothing seemed wrong. Agenda sheet. Executive summary. Draft packet. A silver pen tucked in the spine slot. Then Naomi stepped closer and pointed to the inner pocket seam. There, she said. Elaine Parker came around the table fast, Daniel Cross right behind her. Sewn into the lining near the lower corner was a tiny adhesive dot, no wider than a pencil eraser, matte black against black leather. Easy to miss unless you were looking for something that did not belong. Daniel bent closer. That is not part of the folder. Richard did not answer. His face had gone still in a new way, beyond anger now, into the quiet of a man realizing the breach began before he ever entered the room. Elaine used the tip of a capped pen to lift the edge. The dot came free with almost no resistance. Beneath it was a thin contact patch and a sliver of metallic film. Not a tracker exactly. Something simpler. Something elegant. Daniel exhaled. A short-range credential skimmer. Denise Brooks stared from the service wall, not understanding the hardware, but understanding the tone instantly. Naomi looked from the patch to Richard. It copied your badge? Daniel nodded, eyes still on the tiny strip in Elaine's hand. If Richard placed the folder over his access card even once today, this could have cloned the credential handshake long enough to create a temporary override. Elaine added quietly, or enough to mimic his authorization for one executive corridor pass. Richard thought back through the day with brutal speed. Morning car ride. Office drop. Lunch moved to his desk. Then the packet delivered by conference preparation less than an hour before final review, already arranged inside the folder for signature convenience. He had tucked his badge into the inner slot while taking a call. Simple. Automatic. Thoughtless. The kind of movement people make when the world has never taught them to suspect their own objects. On the wall screen, the cellar's 3 visible participants waited in a strained silence that no longer looked professional. It looked trapped. The silver-haired chief executive began to speak, but Richard lifted one finger without taking his eyes off the leather folder. Do not. The man stopped. Elaine turned the patch carefully between 2 fingers. This was placed with precision, she said. Not by a random intruder. By someone who knew your habits, your materials, and your timing. Daniel straightened slowly. Which means Adrian Vale did not just get close to the floor. He got close to the meeting setup. Richard finally looked up. Inside help. The phrase changed the room again. Not dramatically. Just enough. Enough for every executive at the table to rethink the assistant who delivered packets, the technician who tested the screen, the staffer who arranged name cards and water bottles and thought no one noticed them. Naomi's gaze shifted to the boardroom table, where crystal glasses, sharpened pencils, and carefully spaced folders sat in neat corporate alignment. He did not need everyone, she said. He just needed one person who knew where you stopped looking. Richard turned to her. The truth of that hurt more than the trap itself, because she was right. Men like him were trained to guard the vault, the vote, the valuation, the headline. Not the folder, not the hallway, not the service path. Denise stepped forward at last, only a little, her cleaning shoes soundless on the floor. Sir, she said carefully, conference setup on this floor is not done by one team. Day staff handles the visible stuff. But after 5, hospitality runners and floor support fill gaps if the schedule changes. Elaine's eyes lifted. Who checks them in? Denise swallowed. Usually building operations. Sometimes executive assistants if it is rushed. Daniel was already typing notes. Richard looked toward the badge logs still open on Elaine's screen. Sponsor override. Temporary pass. Executive corridor access. Admin credential mimicry. All of it threaded together now into something uglier because it had been made to look ordinary. Naomi touched the edge of the folder lightly, then withdrew her hand. He wanted you to think the danger was on the page, she said, so you would not notice it was also in the room. Daniel closed his eyes for one brief second. That is exactly what happened. Richard looked at the tiny skimmer, then at the coffee cup, then at the visitor badge, each object plain and cheap against the high gloss of a boardroom built to signal taste, power, and certainty. It struck him with humiliating force that the entire evening had been engineered around one assumption, that powerful people only inspect what they think is worthy of power. On the wall screen, the attorney in Chicago spoke at last, voice carefully measured. Mr. Whitmore, whatever concerns you believe you have discovered, they do not justify accusing our clients of coordinated access fraud. Richard lifted his gaze slowly to the screen. No, he said. The evidence justifies that. He took the skimmer patch from Elaine and held it up where the call could see it. The chief executive's face lost color first. Not much. Just enough. Naomi noticed. So did Richard. Elaine noticed something else. She was staring at the lower participant details again, brows drawn together. Richard, she said, voice low and sharp, the hidden host is gone from the call, but the administrative shell account is still tied to a local relay connection. Daniel looked over. What does that mean? Elaine's fingers flew over the keys. A second. Later the network route appeared on screen. Local node. Internal bounce. Executive floor wireless repeater. The call had not only been accessed from nearby. Part of it was still running through this floor. Through this building. Through something physically close enough to touch. Naomi felt it before the adults did, not because she knew networks, but because she knew patterns. Someone had left in a hurry, yes, but someone had also left something behind. Something still listening. Her eyes moved slowly across the room, past the folders, the water glasses, the polished speakerphone at the center of the table, and stopped on the decorative black stone bowl near the window credenza, the one that had been sitting there all evening like harmless design. She looked at it for 2 seconds, then 3, and her voice came soft enough that everyone had to lean toward her to hear it. I do not think Adrian Vale is the only thing still in here. No one looked at the black stone bowl at first because it had done exactly what it was placed there to do. It had blended in. Smooth matte finish. Oval shape. Decorative and expensive in that deliberate corporate way that signaled taste without inviting attention. It sat on the credenza near the window, holding nothing at all, just a piece of silent design against the glass and city light. Naomi Brooks kept her eyes on it. Richard Whitmore noticed that before he understood why. "What is it?" he asked. Naomi did not answer right away. She stepped away from the table and moved toward the bowl in slow, quiet steps, her old sneakers whispering against the stone floor. The room watched her with the same strange obedience it had given her all evening, as if every adult in that boardroom had finally accepted that when Naomi looked twice at something, they should too. The Manhattan skyline glowed beyond the glass, blue now at the edges, evening settling over the towers in layers of steel and amber, but inside the boardroom the light was clean and white and unforgiving. Naomi stopped a few feet from the credenza. "It does not belong with the others," she said. Elaine Parker glanced over. "What others?" Naomi pointed without touching. "The other things in this room are meant to be used. Pens, water, paper, screens, chairs. This looks like it belongs, but it does not do anything." Daniel Cross stared at the bowl for a second, then at the rest of the room, and something in his face shifted. It was a child's observation, simple enough to sound obvious after the fact, which was exactly why none of them had made it. Richard walked over and stood beside Naomi. Up close, the bowl's surface reflected almost nothing, just a faint dull line from the overhead lights. It was heavier looking than the decorative pieces usually rotated through executive spaces by facilities design. Richard frowned. This was not here yesterday. Denise Brooks spoke from behind them, quiet but certain. "No, sir. The old glass tray was." Richard turned. "You are sure?" Denise nodded. "Yes, sir. I dust this credenza on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. There was a smoked glass tray here with white stones inside. It got moved." Elaine looked up sharply from her laptop. Was there a refresh request for executive decor? Richard did not need to answer. The blank expression on his face did it for him. Daniel was already moving closer. "Do not touch it yet," he said. Naomi tilted her head, listening again. Then she pointed to the table speaker behind them. "The signal was bouncing through the floor," she said. "If someone wanted to hear and see without staying in the room, they would hide it near the glass, not near the door." Richard looked at the bowl, then out at the skyline, then back to the bowl. Glass meant cleaner relay lines. Cleaner sight lines too if there was anything optical hidden in the piece. Elaine shut her laptop halfway and stood. "Daniel, kill the room Wi-Fi repeater." "Already trying." "Do it again." He moved to the wall console and started isolating network zones. On the call screen behind them, the seller's chief executive began speaking in clipped, formal protest, but Richard ignored him. So did everyone else. Adrian Vale had disappeared from the participant list, but his shape was still here in the room, inside the objects, the access, the arrangement. Richard reached toward the bowl, then stopped himself an inch away. Naomi looked at his hand, and then at the object. "If it is listening," she said, "someone might know when you move it." Daniel turned from the console. "She is right. If it is active, we log first." Elaine pulled out her phone, opened an internal facilities app, and checked the tagged asset list assigned to the boardroom. She scrolled once, twice, then looked up. "There is no bowl in the room inventory." Denise gave the slightest nod, as if she had expected that answer. Richard stepped back. "Then what is it?" Elaine answered without taking her eyes off the app, "Something brought in to look permanent." Daniel added, "Which means whoever set this room knew exactly how executives see design." Naomi's gaze stayed fixed on the black stone surface. "They count on people thinking expensive means safe," she said. Richard said nothing. The sentence hit too close to the bone. He looked around his own boardroom then, really looked at it, and saw how much of his life had been built on polished assumptions. Leather meant trusted. Tailored meant competent. Quiet meant loyal. Decorative meant harmless. He had been managing empires by instinct for years. Tonight, a 9-year-old girl had shown him how much of that instinct was just well-dressed blindness. Daniel finished the network isolate, and the wall screen flickered once. The seller's audio cut out, then returned in broken fragments. Elaine looked at him. "Did that do it?" Daniel shook his head. "No. But the local relay strength dropped." Naomi looked at the bowl again. "Because that is helping." Richard turned to Denise. Did you see anyone change this room before the meeting? Denise thought for a moment. Not the whole room, sir. But around 5 o'clock a man in conference black came through with 2 hospitality bins and a setup clipboard. I only saw him from the service corridor. Cap low. Badge turned backward. I thought he was late support. Daniel muttered. Not late support. Embedded setup. Elaine looked to Richard. We need security up here now. Richard's expression hardened. Security answers to the same access system that was just cloned. That stopped her. He was right. Anyone rushing in blind might erase more than they found. Naomi stepped even closer to the credenza, close enough now to see the lower underside of the bowl where it met the wood. There, she whispered. Everyone leaned in. At first Richard saw nothing. Then under the rim, tucked into shadow, he caught the faintest pinpoint pulse. Not bright, not blinking fast. Just a low red ember no bigger than a grain of rice, half concealed inside a recessed notch. Daniel inhaled sharply. That is not decorative. Elaine's face drained of color. Richard felt something cold settle behind his ribs. It was one thing to know he had been manipulated through documents and badges. It was another to stand in his own boardroom and stare at a hidden device still alive under his own glass wall. Naomi did not step back. It is still working, she said. Richard turned to Daniel. Can you kill it remotely? Daniel shook his head. Not without knowing the frequency. If it is self-contained, moving it wrong might wipe stored data. Elaine added, or alert the sender that we found it. Richard looked at the bowl, then at the contract packet, then at the wall screen where the seller's frozen faces waited behind stuttering audio. He had entered this room certain he was the most protected man on the floor. Now everything around him looked penetrable. The folder, the badge, the hallway, the decor. Even the air seemed occupied. Denise moved one small step closer to Naomi, not to pull her back, just to stand nearer. Naomi looked up at Richard at last. If they hid one thing where rich people look, she said, they probably hid another where workers look. Richard frowned. What does that mean? Naomi's eyes shifted from the credenza to the service wall, to the janitor cart, to the ceiling vent above the back corridor door. She listened once more, face calm, and then the realization changed her expression just enough to make Daniel's stomach drop. It means, she said softly, this room was not only built to trap you. It was built to blame someone after. The sentence changed the room more than the device had. It means this room was not only built to trap you. It was built to blame someone after. Richard Whitmore did not answer right away. He stood facing the black stone bowl on the credenza with one hand hanging still at his side, his reflection faint in the dark window beyond it, while the meaning of Naomi's words settled over the boardroom like cold dust. Elaine Parker was the first to move. She turned from the credenza toward the service wall and the back corridor door, her eyes tracking the parts of the room no executive ever noticed for more than a second at a time. The janitor cart, the folded liners, the cleaning caddy, the ceiling vent above the service. Access panel. Daniel Cross followed her gaze and then closed his eyes once, briefly, because he saw it too. If the visible trap failed, if the contract was questioned, if access misuse was discovered, if a device was found in the room, the easiest story in the world would be that support staff had been careless, unauthorized, or worse. Denise Brooks felt the shift before anyone said it out loud. Her shoulders stiffened, and she looked suddenly smaller against the white wall and yellow caution tag hanging from her cart. Not weak, just painfully familiar with how quickly suspicion traveled downhill. Richard turned to her at once. No one in this room will put this on you, he said. Denise held his gaze for a moment, and what passed across her face was not relief exactly. It was the look of a woman who had lived too long inside systems where promises arrived late. Naomi stepped closer to her mother, only half a pace, enough for her shoulder to brush the navy sleeve of Denise's uniform. They do not have to say it, Naomi said quietly. They just have to leave the right things in the wrong place. Daniel looked toward the janitor cart. A spray bottle sat in the top tray beside folded microfiber cloths and a key ring for supply closets. Ordinary things. Harmless things. The kind a legal team would never inspect until after a crisis, when every object starts looking like evidence. Elaine moved toward the cart with measured steps. May I? Denise nodded once. Elaine did not rummage. She looked carefully, respectfully, item by item, and it was Richard who noticed the change in that too. An hour earlier, None of these people would have imagined the general counsel of a major corporation asking permission before touching a cleaner's cart. Now she did. That mattered. Naomi watched Elaine's hands move over the cart without touching most of it. Not there, she said. Elaine glanced up. Where then? Naomi looked toward the ceiling vent above the service corridor door. Somewhere workers would be near, but not own. Daniel followed her eyes. The vent. Naomi nodded. Or the panel beside it. Somewhere a person with a badge could reach, but someone with a uniform would be blamed for standing under. Richard stared at the service area as if seeing the architecture for the first time. The room had been designed in layers of status. Main entrance for executives. Side station for assistants. Back access for service staff. The trap had used the same map the building used every day. Put danger where class already tells people not to look. Put blame where class already tells people to point. Elaine stepped beneath the vent and examined the narrow metal access panel beside it. It was painted the same soft gray as the wall, nearly invisible unless you were close. Daniel joined her. There is a scuff mark, he said. Fresh. Richard crossed the room in 3 long steps. Can you open it? Daniel checked the seam. Not without a facilities key. Denise spoke softly behind him. I have one for supply panels, not electrical. She reached into the side pouch of the janitor cart and pulled out a small brass ring with labeled keys that flashed dully beneath the boardroom lights. For 1 second no one moved. Richard looked at the keys, then at Denise, then at Naomi. The whole room seemed to understand the danger at once. If Denise handed over a key and something incriminating was found behind that panel, any future report could be shaped to sound ugly. Cleaner key. Service access. Restricted wall panel. The story would almost write itself. Naomi saw it immediately. Do not use my mother's key first, she said. Daniel looked back. Why not? Naomi answered without hesitation. Because if it leaves a mark or triggers a log, they will say she opened it. Silence followed. Richard took a slow breath and turned to Elaine. Can your executive override open it? Elaine already had her credential in hand. Yes. Then yours first. Denise lowered the brass ring slightly, and something in her face eased. Not because the danger had passed, but because somebody had finally understood how blame gets arranged long before truth arrives. Elaine stepped to the panel and pressed her badge to the reader set low in the trim. A soft green light blinked. A mechanical click followed. Daniel opened the panel carefully. Inside, wires ran neatly upward toward the ventilation shaft and across a shallow maintenance cavity. At first it looked empty. Then Daniel leaned closer and swore under his breath, not loudly, but enough to fill the room. Attached to the inner side wall with magnetic tabs sat a slim black relay box, smaller than a paperback, connected to a power tap and a thin directional microphone line threaded toward the boardroom ceiling grid. Elaine stared. Richard's mouth tightened. Naomi did not look surprised. That is the second thing, she said. Daniel checked the casing without touching the ports. Audio relay, local repeater, and probably a timed burst transmitter. Elaine added, and it is mounted in a service cavity, which means if security swept this floor after the fact, guess whose area they would ask about first? Denise said nothing. She did not have to. Richard turned to look at her, really look at her, at the navy uniform, the practical shoes, the tired strength in her face, and the realization struck him with painful clarity that this entire night had been built on more than greed. It had been built on confidence in hierarchy. Confidence that powerful men would not inspect humble objects, and that humble people would be easy to accuse once the powerful men panicked. Naomi looked up at him. That is why they wanted you to laugh first, she said. If you laugh at someone, it is easier to blame them later. No one in the room could escape that sentence. Not Richard. Not Elaine. Not the board members who had smirked into their coffee. Not the analysts who had leaned back and enjoyed the joke. Richard felt the memory of his own voice in the room from less than an hour ago, bright and amused and careless, and for the first time in years he had no argument with what shame felt like. He crossed back to the table slowly and looked at the coffee cup, the fake badge, the skimmer patch, the contract, and now the relay box resting in Daniel's gloved hands. A trail of small, ordinary things. Every one of them chosen because people like him were trained not to notice them until it was too late. On the wall screen, the seller's call had degraded into frozen images and intermittent sound, but one line of audio slipped through the speaker in a burst of static and male breath before cutting again. It was Adrian Vale's voice. Calm. Close. Not on the call this time, but somewhere else in the building feed. Eyes widened just slightly, not with fear, but with certainty. He did not leave, she whispered. He is waiting for them to find the wrong person first. The moment Naomi whispered it, the room moved. Not wildly, not loudly, just with the sharp, controlled speed of people who finally understood that waiting was part of someone else's plan. Richard Whitmore turned toward the service corridor so fast the glass table caught and shattered his reflection into fragments of dark suit and white light. Daniel Cross set the relay box carefully on a stack of legal pads and moved for the wall console. Elaine Parker was already closing her laptop and scooping the fake badge, skimmer patch, and coffee cup into separate evidence envelopes from the compliance drawer built into the credenza. Denise Brooks stood beside the janitor cart with one hand on Naomi's shoulder now, not pulling her back, just holding contact, as if the simple fact of touch mattered more than all the polished objects in the room. No one goes alone, Richard said. His voice had lost every trace of corporate ease. It was not loud. It did not need to be. Daniel nodded and opened the internal camera grid on the wall screen where the seller's frozen call had been. One by one, hallway feeds appeared in clean black frames. Executive corridor. Main elevator bank. Reception vestibule. Service hall. Freight landing. For one terrible second, every space looked empty. Then the service elevator camera flickered and returned with a washed-out image of stainless steel doors and gray tile. A man in dark conference black stood half-turned from the lens, cap low, shoulders relaxed, one hand in his pocket as if he belonged there. He was not rushing. That was what made the image colder. Something off, she said. Richard looked at her. How do you know? Naomi pointed to the man's free hand. He keeps checking the time, but not like he is afraid. Like he is matching someone else's schedule. Daniel zoomed the frame. The man's wrist lifted. No watch. He was checking the brushed metal indicator panel above the service elevator. Up arrow. Then down. Then still. Richard's jaw tightened. What is he carrying? Elaine zoomed again. The man's left hand remained inside the pocket of his conference jacket, but the fabric pulled oddly, squared by something small and rigid. A flash drive. A burner phone. A second credential device. None of them liked how many answers fit at once. Naomi's eyes moved from the camera feed to the relay box on the table, then to the contract, then back to the service elevator camera. He is not here to escape, she said. He is here to collect what did not work. That landed hard, because it meant the trap had phases. If Richard signed, they won. If Richard hesitated, they still wanted the devices, the cloned access, the live room capture, and maybe even a planted story to use later. Richard looked toward Denise and Naomi. You two stay here. Denise nodded immediately, but Naomi did not. If he sees only executives coming, he will know you found the room devices, she said. Richard's expression tightened. And that is exactly why you are staying here. Naomi held his gaze for 1 second, then looked past him to the janitor cart. Her mother's cart. Bottles. Liners. Rags. The invisible shield people had been trained not to notice all evening. No, she said softly. That is why he should see us too. Silence. Elaine was first to understand. Richard. He turned. If Denise rolls the cart into the service hall, he may assume routine cleanup, not discovery. Denise looked from Elaine to Naomi to the service camera and understood all of it in one painful breath. The same invisibility that had nearly gotten her blamed could now become cover. Richard hated it immediately. Naomi saw that too. He chose workers because he thought no one would protect them, she said. Then protect them, but do not waste the one thing he gave us. Richard stood very still. It was one thing to admire her mind. It was another to let a 9-year-old girl shape the counter-move in a live corporate ambush. And yet every instinct he trusted tonight had already failed before hers began. He looked at Denise. Only if you agree. Denise swallowed, glanced down at her daughter, then back at the service camera where the man still waited by the elevator like a patient stain. I agree, she said, but she stays behind me. Naomi gave the smallest nod. Daniel drew up the hall map on screen. Service corridor from this door to the elevator is 62 feet. Approaching cart and relaxed. Standing beside a cleaning cart. Behind the turn of the corridor, Richard and Daniel were moving into position from the executive side exactly as planned. Elaine's voice came through Daniel's phone speaker in a low whisper. Main hall access sealed. Elevator controls frozen on my mark. Adrian glanced once toward the ceiling camera and seemed to understand more than he liked. Still, he smiled faintly. Mr. Whitmore should have signed when he had the chance. Denise found her voice before fear could take it from her. And after that, what? You blame the workers for the devices? For the access? For the room? Adrian's gaze returned to her, cool and assessing. Mrs. Brooks, companies rarely blame anyone. They simply follow facts. Naomi shook her head. No, they follow the story that gets there first. That landed. Adrian knew it landed because it was true. The young man beside the elevator shifted uneasily and looked toward the stairwell as if calculating distance. Richard chose that moment to step around the corridor corner. Then the story starts here, he said. Adrian turned, and for the first time his control thinned at the edges. Daniel came from the opposite side. Phone raised, camera recording, his tie loose, his face pale but steady. The service corridor suddenly had no open direction left. Stainless steel elevator doors behind Adrian. Executive authority in front of him. Evidence already bagged upstairs. Elaine's voice snapped through the speaker. Now. A soft chime echoed from the elevator panel. Lock engaged. Adrian's eyes flicked to the control light, then back to Richard. You are making this messier than it needs to be. Richard stopped 6 feet away, close enough now to see the fine texture of Adrian's coat, the expensive stitching, the small arrogance in his stillness. No, he said. I am making it visible. The silence that followed was clean and hard. Naomi stood beside her mother and watched the shape of power change in real time. An hour ago, Richard Whitmore had been the kind of man who confused command with certainty. Now he looked different. Not softer, not smaller, just awake. Adrian tried one last angle, turning his attention past Richard toward the boardroom end of the corridor as if the real audience were still the people who mattered. You have no signed deal, no admitted intent, and no chain proving I authorized anything in that room. Naomi answered before Richard could. You do not need a chain when you leave the pattern everywhere. Adrian looked at her again. Naomi went on, voice calm and clear in the metallic hush of the hallway. The hidden host. The fake badge. The cloned access. The revised appendix after the summary. The relay box in the service wall. The decorative bowl by the glass. The service floor timing. The blame path. It all points the same way. Not because one thing proves it. Because all of it only makes sense together. Daniel lowered the phone slightly, stunned all over again, not by the information now, but by the clarity. Adrian seemed to understand in that moment that the most dangerous thing Naomi had done was not catch one clause or one device. She had seen the design. Richard heard it too. The entire architecture of the night compressed into one simple truth. Someone had built a trap out of status, access, paperwork, and prejudice, trusting that the people at the top would overlook the details and the people at the bottom would carry the blame. Richard turned his head slightly toward Daniel. Send every file, every log, every recording to outside forensic counsel and federal counsel now. Daniel nodded at once and moved. Adrian's face settled into something flatter. You really are going to let a child set fire to a 9-figure transaction? Richard looked at Naomi, then at Denise, then back at Adrian. When he answered, his voice was quiet enough that everyone in the corridor had to listen closely. No, I almost let a 9-figure transaction bury the only person in this building who told me the truth. The words hung there under the fluorescent corridor lights, cleaner than anger, heavier than pride. Denise's hand found Naomi's shoulder again. Naomi did not smile. She only exhaled. Somewhere behind the glass walls of the tower, Manhattan kept glowing, traffic moving in thin red lines, windows burning gold against the dark, a whole city full of people being underestimated in rooms they were never supposed to matter inside. Richard stepped aside then, not to free Adrian, but to look directly at Denise Brooks. Mrs. Brooks, he said, and the title sounded different now, stripped of class, stripped of convenience. I owe you an apology. And Naomi, he added, turning to the little girl in the yellow hoodie, I owe you far more than money. Naomi looked up at him, her face calm in the sterile light. Then do not laugh at the next person before you know what they carry. No one spoke after that. Not Adrian. Not Daniel. Not even Richard. Because there was nothing to add that would make the sentence truer. The service elevator stayed locked. The evidence stayed in hand. The trap had failed, but the room that mattered most had changed in a quieter way. Richard Whitmore had entered the evening seeing a janitor and her daughter. He left it understanding that decency, like danger, often arrives through the door power forgets to guard. And as the building lights hummed above them and Denise pulled Naomi gently closer, the little girl who had been treated like a joke stood in the center of the silence like the only thing in the tower that had not needed to pretend.